And a very warm welcome from me too, to all the members of the public and also to our panelists this afternoon. As was said, our subject for tonight, for this afternoon, is migration societies and European memory. But before we start talking about that, I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce the speakers to you. I'll start with Nadette Foley, who looks back on, well, probably 30 years of a very rich experience as a mediator and counselor in the fields of human rights, in refugee support and all the related fields. She has been focusing on peacemaking and on intercultural dialogue throughout her career. Currently, she works at the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation in Ireland, near Dublin. And there she runs the Intercultural and Refugee Programme. Her activity also focuses on self-care trauma healing, which I found very interesting, for both refugees themselves, but also for refugee advocates, which is also an interesting approach. She has also been working closely with Irish Muslim communities or African Irish communities. And interestingly for us tonight, perhaps, in a more recent initiative, she has been counselling museums in Dublin and Belfast in their process of decolonisation. I'm hoping that I'm putting this correctly. Probably readapting their collection and their ideological outset to the new developments of our time. We're also joined tonight by the author and independent journalist Dima Kalaji. Very welcome to you too, whom you might know from her articles in Die Zeit, in the German weekly Die Zeit, or from the radio. She was born in Damascus and has been living in Germany, in Berlin, since 2013. And ever since then, she has been working her own experience of leaving her home country and of familiarizing herself with German society into her writing. After the Syrian uprising in 2011, she co-founded a very important radio station called Suri Ali, which was to become one of the most important media outlets in the years to come. She also produced a bilingual podcast at the German public radio, Deutschlandfunk Kultur, as I said, in 2 languages and with all kinds of changes of perspective, very interestingly. She is also a member in a platform called Wir machen das, We Are Doing It, where she contributes to various projects, from a literary initiative called Weiterschreiben, Writing On, that brings together renowned writers from Germany and the German-speaking world with their colleagues from around the world. Or another project that is called Living Archive, in which she records memories and experiences of people who lived under the dictatorships in both Syria and the GDR, respectively. I would also like to welcome Agnieszka Kosowicz. I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Agnieszka Kosowicz is the president of the board of the Polish Migration Forum, which is one of the most important organizations in that domain in Polish society, one could say. She's based in Warsaw, and she has been one of Poland's probably most active and most vocal advocates of migration and refugee support in the years since 2000, when this issue in Poland has become more and more controversial, I think one could say. She has been trying to promote a dialogue between all the involved sectors. That has been one of the main aims of her organization, which she built up from scratch, as far as I know. So the main aim was to promote this cooperation between all the involved sectors and institutions, and as I said, in a political climate that was oftentimes conservative, probably in Poland. She has been championing this idea of a more holistic approach, a more tolerant approach to all the issues regarding diversity, inclusion, integration in Polish society. A warm welcome to you too, Patrick Simon. I'm sorry, I knew I was going to make this mistake. Patrick Simon. Patrick Simon is the director of research at the French Institute for Demographic Studies and is also affiliated with the Paris Institute of Political Sciences, the Sciences Po, as a fellow in research program on discrimination on social inequality. He investigates issues like racism, ethnical discrimination, religious discrimination, but also, of course, the policies that we need to tackle these issues in our societies. He also focuses in his scholarly work not only on European migration, but also on ethnic minorities in North America, which may be a subject in our discussion this afternoon. And also, interestingly, more recently, he has been involved in a wide-ranging project, wide-ranging survey on diversity in French society, on diversity within the French population, and the impact that origin has on the social trajectories of people in French society. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for your willingness to share your expertise. There will be, just to give you a quick orientation, there will be sufficient opportunity towards the end to ask our panelists any question that you wish to ask. But I'd like to start us off at the beginning with a piece of art that I found quite powerful and that I discovered at an exhibition in Vienna last year. I'll just simply show it to you. It's a crystal ball mounted on a heap of live vests that actually belonged to refugees crossing the Mediterranean Sea. The artist, of course, many of you will have recognized him, is the Chinese artist and activist Ai Weiwei. who is one of the voices, one of the people who have dealt intensively with this subject in the past few years. And because we've talked a lot about history and rightfully looked back, and we will do so in the course of our discussion as well. But at the outset, I'd like to ask you to try to look into the future, like as if we had this crystal ball and it would do something for us, as if it actually worked. And I'd like to ask you what you think European immigration and emigration will look like in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years for the next generations. Because I think we are very much focused on our demand to migrants to adapt to the societies that they come into. But we are forgetful, if not in denial, the fact that the phenomenon of migration has changed our own societies for the past hundreds of years, not only for the past few years, and that the changes that these migrants, the changes that migration has affected on our societies are already in place. Yeah? And that it's always a two-way process. It's not only the migrants adapting to the Western way of life, but it's also a process of profound transformation that we are in the midst of. What do you think? What would your predictions be? In which direction are we heading? Maybe start with Nadette.
Okay. Thank you, Laura.
Crystal ball.
Yes, well, there's a phrase you've just referred to, the two-way process. The Irish government for the last 25 years has used the term the integration as a two-way process. But I think it's perhaps only now becoming real, and that there is real government commitment to that vision. And I think it's really happening because of the activism underneath at community level, and the welcome that refugees and people from diverse backgrounds are getting. And I think the Ukrainian situation has actually made a very big shift, and we'll talk about that later. But I think that's partly in the background here, because in the last 30 years that I've been working with refugees in Ireland, the refugee issue has been seen as something temporary by government and state bodies, something that would probably go away. And they were sort of puzzled in the 90s. They used to summon me in to the Department of Justice and ask me and my chairperson, why are they coming here? We're a poor country. And we were still. And in 1992, when the Bosnian War erupted, Ireland was asked by the EU to do something to take responsibility. And we took, in a population of over 4 million at that time, we took 200 Bosnian refugees initially. They grew with family reunification. But Norway, which was not and still isn't an EU country, took 4,000 and had the same population as Ireland. So the difference now is that in 2022, when the Ukrainians came, we actually welcomed them as Europeans. And we welcome them because we are now a rich country in Europe, and because we feel a moral responsibility. And that responsibility was always felt by the people, but I think the government now feels that, and feels that it is about protecting democracy. So I feel quite hopeful that the government is now, and all levels of Irish society are beginning to take forced migration very seriously. We've always taken economic migration more seriously, and we'll go into that in a minute. And we've always seen ourselves as a country, as emigrants. And you have to remember that it was only in 1995 that Ireland became a country of net immigration. So that story is a very big one. So looking into the future, we have begun to embrace over the last 25 years the fact that our growing economy needs high-skilled migrants and low-skilled migrants and people in the middle. So we have, when we're short of people, we go out around the world. Recently, we did a visa waiver for South African bus drivers. Why? Because they speak English and they drive on the left-hand side of the road. In the 90s and 2000s, we went to the Philippines and we went to Nigeria and South Africa again because we didn't have enough nurses, and we brought them in. So in terms of economic migration, the difficulty is that we don't just want them to be workers. Now Irish society is becoming more diverse. One of the most amazing things in my 30 years happened last week. I attended the launch of a book, and it's called Black and Irish. And it's by an organisation, look them up. They do podcasts with our national broadcaster, and they're called Black and Irish. And these are the second and some maybe third generation growing up in Ireland. So suddenly they are claiming their right to be Irish, not to be, where do you come from or where do you really come from? Because that's what they get asked as they're growing up in Ireland. But now they are Hollywood actors like Ruth Negga, footballers like Gavin Bazunu. We even had Dami on Love Island, which you probably have a German version of Love Island. So we have, artists and graphic designers and fashionistas and everybody, and they are claiming their place in Irish society. And the oldest person in that book is a man called Jude Hughes, who was born in 1941 to a white Irish mother and a Ghanaian father. And at that time, the father could not stay in Ireland because of our visa laws. He was a student. But now this generation are diversifying everything, and they are demanding to be given equal spaces in the media. There's an organisation that is specifically from Black and ethnic minority creatives, and they are training up young people to use digital media to tell their own stories.
Agnieszka, Kosowicz, what about Poland? What about processes of diversification in Poland? Where do you think Poland is heading there? So if in Ireland one can talk about Black and Irish at the moment, will there come a time when in Poland you can talk about, I don't know, Muslim and Polish?
To be honest, I would be happy to start with a wider view, because reading the crystal ball is my hidden skill.
Well, then please do.
So I think that in Poland, what we do is we watch you, and we watch a lot of Western countries, because we have a feeling that what happens in Poland now is an experience of some other countries back, 50 years ago. But also, with this feeling, we have a feeling that something really special happens, and that this experience of hosting the Ukrainian refugees or migrants or guests, because they're described in different words right now, is some kind of a prelude to the future. And we have this feeling that what happens in Poland will happen on a bigger scale shortly, because of climate change. And looking at what happens globally, and now using the crystal ball, we know that there will be very many more migrants. And we also know that they will be heading north. And we are north. So we know that we need to expect multiplications of the Ukrainian crisis in the near future. Talking about 2 billion people over the last, 30 years. So I think that this is not even a crystal ball, but this is the knowledge that we have right now. And at the same time, we see that I've read a very interesting book that I recommend by a British author, actually, Gaia Vince, who wrote a book that's called The Nomad Century, about future migration and climate change. And what she gives in this book is a very positive, civilized, polite idea how the world could manage this flow of people, how the countries should cooperate, how new cities should be built, and how we should reconstruct our global world in a way that would enable movement of billions of people from the areas that will become uninhabitable to those that will be inhabitable, and that includes North Europe. And then I was astonished that during her speech at the Vienna Migration Conference, half of the people from the first rows left, very upset. And there were the politicians who said that whatever she is saying, maybe this is true, but it is wrong to say it because it gets people afraid, and that she threatens with her knowledge the political world. And then I also see wars. Everybody sees, you see as well, what happens in the Middle East. We see the instability in Syria, we see Afghanistan, also touched by the earthquake. So we see very many unstable countries that do not become stable. We see countries that are still very poor, and we have gotten used to handling that fact that the standard of living in Europe is much higher than in some other countries, and we are fine with this. And I don't think that we recognize enough that the people there are not fine with this, and that they see our standard of living, and that this is frustrating to experience very, very severe inequalities. So now how it will affect Poland. I think that also with all this said, I will be happy to kind of tell you more about this parallel between history and what we live in Poland. But I think that I would like to also bring up Greece and Greek comedies and Greek tragedies and Greek human nature presented in literature, because it shows us very well how we are all the same, that we still have anger, anxiety, fear, that we can be empathetic, but we can be really mean, that we kill each other, that we fight with brothers, and lots of truths that were truths 4,000 years ago are still truths. Going to Berlin today on the train, I have read an article about some new discovery in Egypt, where some inscription that is dated 4,000 years ago was reading about a son complaining to the parents that they don't send him money wherever he is. And it was written in this, 4,000 years back language.
Deciphered with help of artificial intelligence. I read the same article probably.
Yes. But I think it's definitely our Polish example right now, that things just happen repeatedly, and of course these decorations change, but our nature and how we approach issues, how we solve problems, we mirror our predecessors' approaches. And while maybe we don't learn as fast as we would like, there's definitely lessons there. And I think that what we can do is reconsider how we read history, or how we draw conclusions, and maybe how we make our decisions today.
Thank you for this input. One of the ways that the future already reaches into the present, Patrick Simon, is the fact that in more and more urban centers throughout Europe, the proportion of population with migrant backgrounds is approaching this 50% mark. That is a phenomenon in Vienna. It's being discussed quite intensively at the moment. And this, I think, entails that already now, if not in the future, and all the more so in the future, we won't be able to simply speak of minorities anymore, because they're simply numerically not a minority anymore in the initial sense of the word. So there's this cleavage that I was talking about between the right-wing populist conservative view that is trying to keep society in this pre-migration stadium that it never had, actually. So I don't know that it ever had this pure form of national existence. So this on the one hand, and on the other hand, this undeniable reality that migration has already essentially shaped our societies. But having arrived at this turning point with the 50%, do you think it will also be a key moment in our mentality, in a shift of mentalities, in our way of approaching the subject of migration?
Well, yeah. I don't know. I mean, demographers are very good for the crystal ball. I mean, we are very much very known for that, even though predicting about migration is always a very complicated exercise, for the good reason that they do not happen what we think they're going to happen. And if you go back in history, short history, after 1989, I mean, everybody was waiting for a massive migration from Russia because of the fall of the Soviet Empire. And it didn't happen. But most of the discussion, if you were there 30 years ago, 34 years ago, we would have the discussion around what's going to happen because of this opening of a new area, and so many people are striving to move away. And actually, there have been some movement, but not as much as expected. And most of the movement that happened were later, coming from the new European EU state members from the eastern part of Europe who benefit and took the free movement seriously to move. And that's something that happened, of course, in the UK and maybe stimulate a bit of the Brexit. But nevertheless, that's another type of movement that were not expected as well, or not foreseen at this level. So all this movement and change in societies, as you mentioned, have produced changing. So that's something that we can see in history and right now. So it's not the future. The future is here. The debates about this minority majorities, which is a tricky one somehow, and has to be dealt with some kind of distance, because it's really very quickly come to a discussion between us and them, which is more complicated than that, because of course the diversity within is not between us and them. We are diverse. It's not them, it's we, which is not exactly the same discussion. So the future of we as a diverse society is something, and diverse societies as something to be written and to be discussed. The fact that most of the global North society do perceive themselves as threatened by migration is undermining the situation of this diversity within, because those who are supposed to come are very close to those who are already there. And of course, it is fueling negative discourse about those who are totally legitimate in our societies, but do have a migration background, to say, and are perceived as not totally legitimate to participate to society like the others. So there are communication between what we do about migrants and what we do about the cohesion within our societies. So that's one of the crystal ball discussion, which is, well, we should try to avoid antagonizing population based on this history of migration. Most of our European societies have a long history of migration, more or less. What is new is that in the context of these national buildings that happened at the end of the 19th century, we are in a new sequence of migration, which is not only movement inside Europe, but which is an expansion of the movement from the global south to the global north. And that's changed a bit the picture, and specifically because it comes from the former colonial empire for some of the European countries that used to have colonial empire, which is not true for all the European countries as much as it is for some of them, but nevertheless, that creates a new situation. That is what has been perceived as the diversity outside is the diversity within, with its history of colonialism, which is not totally embraced or not totally accepted among our societies. So that's maybe something that should be tackled, and I hope we will go back to that. So just to say, you're right mentioning the fact that, let's say, cosmopolitanism.
It's
complicated to say.
Cosmopolitanism.
So many syllabs. Is an everyday experience in most European big cities. Is so much there in Berlin, is so much there, of course, in Paris, in Vienna, in Stockholm, in Brussels. The numbers are huge. Doesn't mean that it's always visible. It depends who are those who have a migration background. It might be invisible or very visible, depending. But it is shaping the organization of the society. So that's something that we should address, because it's fueling, and that's what you mentioned about populist parties, is fueling a reaction which is a denial of the situation, or a kind of fantasy that we should go back from pre-migration time, as if it was possible to go back in time, and to see the 1950s as a golden age where everything was so fine, forgetting poverty, forgetting the end of the war, forgetting everything that was in the crash in Europe, and thinking that that was really the moment where we were so in progress and capacity to embrace a new world. So that's something which is all over the place in a lot of countries, and the difference between the 50s and now is that it was less diverse ethnically, racially, and it was perceived as more cohesive because of that. So that's, I would say, I'm a bit too long, and I'm stopping there, that's one of the challenges for this diversity, is to put diversity into a cohesive perception of the society rather than a divisive one, which is the one of the message which is sent by some of the forces.
Well, the crystal ball should tell us how to do that. That will be the big secret. But many thanks for your input. Dima, Albitar, Kalaji, can I ask you the crystal ball question as well? Because we were just talking about visibility and invisibility and all these dichotomies and cohesion rather than division. Do you think we are missing a common culture of remembrance, and I mean common to both people with migrant background, with fresh migrant background, and people with older migrant background? Is that a missing link?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. And I just want to keep on with what you were saying actually about the migration and the minorities. And I'm going to share like a personal experience that just happened a few days ago. I was with my daughter at the City Hall, in Pankow City Hall, for a few papers. And we were talking, and I had to mention that I was born in Syria. And then my daughter mentioned that my mom and my dad are from Syria. So the officer just told her right away, but not you. And Lynn was confused, actually. She's only 7, but she told her, like, no. And she thought, because you were born here. With a lot of surprise, actually. And she said, yes. And I think and Lynn is going to actually face this situation for all of her life. And I think when we want to talk about this 50% of background of migration, we really need to rethink again with the power dynamic in the society. It's with him, with who, and the economic, and how we actually call certain people from certain classes expats, and the other ones are immigrants and refugees, and where do they live, and all of this. So I think it's not really about the percent, and we can't, so this is why we can't really see everyone as a one group of migrants, because, and when you look at this it's classes and layers and minorities and yeah.
I'd like to take you up on that point of a kind of two-tier migrant existence, more or less so, of these double standards applied to the good and the bad migrant. Why do we have those double standards? We had the example in Poland as well with the Ukrainians on the one hand and all the others, irrespective of where they came from, who were treated with hostility, to say the least, in the past few years. How come it's so different? Where does this come from?
I don't think there is an easy answer, or at least the answer is not as easy as many would like. That is the color. I think there is more than the color. Maybe it should be said that there is a racial element to this differentiation, but I think it's not only that. And it was these non-Ukrainian populations that started to arrive to Poland earlier, because the Belarusian situation would just maybe to put it in very short words that the government of Belarus provoked a migration channel, bringing people over, flying them with planes to the immediate proximity of the Polish or European border, and then pushing people across the border to make this crossing in an irregular way. And then Polish government started to push the people back. So groups were stuck. In principle, there were some groups that literally were physically stuck in this between the border zone, and unable to move backwards and unable to move forward. We have been working with people that were pushed back and forth 15, 17, more than 20 times. So it was rather grave. Some 50 people have died, or at least were identified to die at that border. So the welcome that these persons have been met with was hostile, and it remains hostile, because even now, as we sit here, there are people crossing this border, despite the fact that there was a wall built, kind of similar to the American-Mexican fence, and people keep crossing that wall, breaking bones, and every week there is few hundred people are making it, and actually going to Germany. So after making this crossing. And it was interesting that even the same border guards and police officers were providing assistance to the refugees on the Ukrainian border. And the boarding crossings sometimes were 20, 30 kilometers apart. So the same staff was pushing people back to the Belarusian part, and then carrying babies from the Ukrainian border towards Poland in the Ukrainian part. So this treatment was drastically different. But then we are observing what was happening with Ukraine. Definitely there was this proximity component. And it was not the skin color as such the issue. It was the issue that it was the same color as we have, and that it was the group of people that was really alike. And it's like, I've been working with migration for 20 years or more. And for many, many workshops and trainings, I was telling people that refugees are just like us. But believe me, it's a different story to see a refugee from Ukraine driving I don't know, Polo, Volkswagen, just as I have, to have a mobile phone exactly like I have, with kids that are dressed like my kids. And just seeing this extreme alikeness of the people that were coming from Ukraine was shocking to the Polish population, because you didn't need a training and you didn't need a workshop. You just saw folks that as soon as they crossed the border, you wouldn't tell that they are from another country. And this proximity, I think, was very kind of awakening or shocking for the Polish people. And it was not only the color as such, but it was the fact that you have people that are really like you, that made a lot of people very empathetic. I think it was also an issue of sex, because in the discussion about the Belarusian part of the border, we talk primarily about young men, because it is much more difficult to make this way being a woman. There are some women, we had some pregnant women, we had some small babies, but they are definitely a minority. And it is easy to develop this narrative that is common across Europe, that it is only single men, and what are the motivations. And in the Ukrainian situation, we didn't have this discussion, because you only had women with children. It was, by definition, this movement was excluding men. So only the man who, for example, had a disabled child, or a man who had a wife in the army, or a man who had a disabled child could cross. So the population that we have received from Ukraine was some 90% or 95% women and children. And this was also meaningful. And when we talk about these thousands or millions of Polish people that accepted a Ukrainian family to their homes, I think this safety component, or feeling of safety and feeling that you accept a mother and children, was important. That for a lot of people, they felt secure allowing a family into their homes.
Can I just ask you, in connection with that, do you think this Ukrainian experience that the Poles went through will be a lesson? Will it change something in their attitude towards migration in general?
Yeah, I liked your comments that we are living a history. So I think that we are we are in the process of changing or rethinking who we are, or redefining our own feeling of identity, and also learning. So I believe this is a lesson. We had this parliamentary elections yesterday, and we had 72% turnout. And please, I mean,
it's huge. Yeah?
Whatever you applaud today, applaud this, because it's something exceptional. No, I'm sorry. I thought it's like a metaphorical way, but it is exceptional, and I think that this is somehow connected with this experience of housing and hosting Ukrainian people, because it gave a lot of people, also a lot of young people, this feeling of impact, that you can actually do things, that you can affect reality. And it's like 75% of Polish people got somehow involved into this helping process, providing accommodation, but also food, or serving as volunteers, or transporting people. And it was something special. It was really an unusual experience for the society, and a lot of people really felt empowered. We don't have a tradition of volunteering in Poland, and here suddenly you could do things, and you could, have a feeling that you saved somebody's life, or at least give them a peaceful place to sleep. And somehow it is transformative to have this impact.
I was thinking about what Patrick Simon said about cohesion and the cohesive way of looking at those dichotomies, and asking myself whether this experience may help Polish society and Ukrainian society to heal some of their open wounds and their frozen conflict and so on, because it hasn't always been pure solidarity, historically speaking. And there are very, very divergent narratives on the same historical events still ongoing.
It's, I think you're very polite. Because
am.
it's like, what we were doing with the Ukrainians would slaughter each other's pregnant women and take out the babies. So it's like the history that we have is more than bloody. It is really very, very painful. And I don't think whether or not we are able to heal. I think that we are on some kind of path that can go either way, that we can become more empathetic and more humane and I don't know, more kind to each other. But at the same time, I have to say that this process of assisting society to society is very emotionally draining and it's very demanding. And a lot of people now are just tired. It's if you host a stranger, it looks very romantic and very nice and great. But then just imagine your own house and imagine your own flat or wherever you live, and just think about it that you have some folks that you don't know living there with you for a year or a year and a half. It's not at all easy. It's like in some instances, the people that you have welcome are like you, and you want to spend time with them and you enjoy these dinners together. But in some occasions, these are people that you don't like. They are not like you. You have nothing in common. You have nothing to talk about, and you still handle them in your house. And it develops a lot of frustration as well. So I guess that there is space for empathy and understanding, but there is also a lot of space for disagreements, for disappointment, for frustration, and then how it will go, we don't know yet.
Nadette, in your work, you will probably agree with this, because you've been focusing on these processes of healing, which are probably not linear.
No, indeed. And yeah, I can relate to what you're saying there, Agnieszka, because there is the kind of trope of the grateful refugee, and refugees are some sort of cuddly, thing that you can take into your house. And it's long before the Ukrainian situation, but way back, in fact, in the Bosnian and Croatian, Serbian situations back in '92, I would have had refugees turning up in my house. And some of them had actually been taken in by family blood relatives in Ireland. There was a young teenage man who turned up in my office with his suitcase, thrown out by that same family because, again, he turned out to be, a problematic teenager. He wasn't the cuddly refugee that, their cousins sent them on a plane. And another man who is an ethnographer, published anthropologist, and currently lives in Wales, and we're still friends. He was thrown out by an Irish family who had taken him in because he got to know somebody in the European Commission, and the mother in Dublin took him in. And again, he turned out to be, a cranky character, very bright and very wonderful some days and very difficult other days. And so, that's the reality of hosting refugees. And I've done it myself over the years. But what we have now, I suppose, is that the Ukrainian situation in Ireland, if you think about it, in Ireland in the last 10 or 20 years, we've had maybe between 4,000 and 6,000 or 7,000 people seeking international protection because we're an island at the other end of another island, 2 seas to cross from Europe. We're not easy to get to. So that was our level, and our level of programme refugees through UNHCR since 2000 has been like about 30 or 50 a year. So suddenly March 22 happens, and the European Commission, decides, okay, let's implement that rusty temporary protection directive on a shelf that we've never implemented before, because this is existential, this is on our borders. And suddenly on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, people start connecting with Ukrainians. And maybe, there were maybe some thousands, a small number of Ukrainians who'd lived in Ireland, like my local boxing club is run by a Ukrainian who's lived in Dublin for 20 years. So there were connections there, and then more connections happened, and people might have gone to one country and then decided, they'd come further, So we now have 95,000 Ukrainians. Most of whom are being put up in hotels and hostels, and even some in tents by the government. But 15,000 are being hosted by Irish families. But sprung up, we do have a tradition of volunteering, and we are apparently one of the highest countries on We Fund It for charitable donations as well. So we do have that tradition of humanitarianism and volunteering and community responsibility. So we now have an organisation which sprung up called Helping Irish Hosts, and they are supporting the hosts, and they recognise this trauma, this vicarious trauma, the burnout, the frustration, the difficulty of hosting. So if you want to stop hosting after a year, you can contact them, you can find another family, and they will help with the move. And the government is giving €8,000 a month to, €800 a month to families to host Ukrainians. But we also have depopulated villages in Leitrim, which is the least populated county in Ireland out of our 26 counties. And there they raised money and they built a few mobile homes. They bought mobile homes and they built the platforms for them. And they welcomed several Ukrainian families because the school was lacking in pupils and was going to lose its second teacher. So we have villages and islands even that are now trying to arrange to have Ukrainians and possibly other refugees come to live with them. But to talk about the trauma healing, we are trained in a program called Capacitar, and it's an international organization that's running for 35 years, and it's running in about 40 countries around the world. And if you look it up, Capacitar, it's a Spanish word, .org, you can get the emergency kit in over 40 languages. And we immediately contacted the founder in March last year and said we need it in Russian and Ukrainian. So we got it, and we're getting it in other languages of international protection applicants, Georgian, Albanian, Somali and Yoruba. So basically it's a self-care program. It's based on indigenous practices which are now backed up by the new neuroscience, which talks about trauma being trapped in the body and movement in the body. You could dance it out, you can yoga, Pilates, whatever your cultural expression is. But this is a program which has been very carefully put together by a psychologist called Dr. Patricia Kane. She's based in California, and she's put the simplified Tai Chi, emotional freedom technique, finger holds for emotions, various small self-care practices that we can do for our own vicarious trauma working with refugees, and that we can pass on through those practices in languages, but actually just demonstrate physically. So you can use it without language. And it has been evaluated very carefully in the detention camps on the US-Mexican border with the people coming up from Latin America. And that's been going on for 15 or 20 years. So it's been found to be very effective, and we're using it in refugee centres, and particularly now with Ukrainians and refugees from elsewhere and people who work with them.
We'll definitely talk some more in a minute about these artistic approaches rather than the politicized pedagogical approaches to these issues. But first of all, I'd like to ask Dima, because you nodded when Nadette said something about the cuddly refugee, this trope of the grateful refugee. Do you want to comment?
I think many of the people, and because I'm Syrian, many of the people were hosted by great individuals, and there was like really a great support, especially at the summer of 2015, and which turned out very quickly, unfortunately, to be the Flüchtlingskrise, which is a political, not refugees. But yes, there is this assumption actually from those people who are coming. But when you feel like you are just labeled through it and just portrayed through it, in some point it becomes like overwhelming, and it was very interesting while you were talking about the trauma that trapped in the body and this training that the people who are hosting having, because this is really very, very important. And the other thing that people who are coming, and many of them actually who crossed the sea, they come. I was actually one of the lucky who came with a legal visa, but many of the people, I have many friends who actually had to cross the sea also. But we had to leave our country in a very, very, and lose our lives in a very difficult situations and difficult dictatorship. And I came just a few months after the chemical weapons attack happens in Syria. And you come here to a completely different new world, knowing no language, knowing no atmosphere, so I am also traumatized. I am traumatized in my country very severely, and I am traumatized from the journey, and I am traumatized when I arrive. So it doesn't really matter how I'm cuddly person in my life used to be. I am not at the moment, for sure. And really, it took me years until I could normalize and myself again and recognize myself again and understanding the severe post-trauma that I was having and how it's affecting my life and how it was affecting my reactions. And especially in teenagers and young people, they are not just, they're losing also that because many of them like come without families. So of course it's very, very difficult for them. And just waiting from them to be grateful and integrate very quickly in the societies and in schools and everything, it's just like beyond any limits and beyond, it's not even realistic actually. And 10 years ago when I came, and I'm very actually happy that more and more there's more talking in about mental health with the context of refugees crisis, because before 10 years when I arrived and many people arrived, this wasn't really one of the main discussions at all. And having like more experience and knowing how important this is from both sides, I think really this is very important.
Is this why you as well try to tie in your way of dealing with your own experience with other methods than the scholastic ones? You use art, you use literature, you use writing, but I'm sure there are 1,000 more ways of approaching this. Is it more efficient?
Yeah, for me, I think yes. I was once like working in a project, like it was mapping Damascus, Berlin, and it was about how many of the Syrians who arrived were trying to recreate the city of Damascus inside Berlin. So like many of the Syrians name places in over like Damascus neighborhoods they used to live in or they experienced. And if you really see the pictures, it's not really similar at all. But like many of the people, like just the brains, because it's trying to make a new experience with a familiar place. So like this looks like this and this like this. And I was working on this project with the German author Annette Groschner, and we were at the Stasi Museum. And we went into one of the offices, and both of us, she looked at me and she said, "It smells like GDA." And I told her, "It smells like the secret police offices in Syria." And it was like, in this point, when we realized that we are from different generations, different countries, and we experienced dictatorship, very different dictatorships, of course, but it left us, after so many years from living there, it left us with that same experience, and we were triggered in a way. And this is where it comes, our project, Smell of Dictatorship, later on. And it's about how we leave dictatorships, but they don't leave us. And about the senses and how can they be triggered after a very long time, after a very small details, but then it brings you back to this experience. And then the second project came, which is Lebendiges Archiv. And it also tracks not only how our bodies are archived of what we have experienced, but we also went into the Stasi archive and we asked for the files of Syria. Because we knew that there's a relationship between both of them, Syria and the GDR, but the amount of cooperations between both countries was enormous. And I was going through the documents, and there's, of course, it's, for me as a Syrian, it's my only access to that history because there was no way to go from the files from the Syrian side. And it's like the only time that I hold in my hands real documents about this. So it's not like a documentary or a report or anything. And the effect of those documents, regardless from the whole research, it really had a very intense effect on me. And in some levels, it was healing in a way, because I have experienced those things when I was a child and when I was a teenager. And now I'm reading the documents that shaped them. I mean, those people who don't know, of course, that I exist, and back then I didn't know their names, but they have shaped my life.
I have a very personal reaction to this kind of projects, bringing together different but similar experience of dictatorships, because I grew up in Romania under Ceausescu, under communism, and this is an experience shared by Agnieszka probably as well. And one of the issues that I'd like to put to you in this context is there's a lot of room in public discourse for dealing with the Nazi past, for dealing with the impact of the Second World War, all these things. But societies are more diverse than that, and there's much less room for the impact of communist dictatorship on the lives of the generations that are shaping today's societies. And of course, I don't want to stop there. Yeah, that there's the Middle East, there's Africa. All these experiences of dictatorship come with us through the process of migration and are imported into Western societies as well. And I'd like all of us to think about the way those people have to feel having to reduce the space given in their new societies to their own suffering, to their own memories of atrocities and dictatorship. Do you think this is a problem? And I'm asking Patrick as well, because he has perhaps an idea of what the new generations bring into this discussion. Is there a change? Is there, even statistically speaking, is there a change between this attitude and the new generation's attitude, who is more inclusive, even in their knowledge of different histories rather than just history?
Well, it's a very important question. I mean, it's complicated to see how the transmission of histories, of family histories, for example, related to migration is made in families. What we identified in several projects is that actually, maybe strangely enough, it's not that much transmitted. That is, the parents who migrated do not talk that much about their experience. They tend to project themselves in the future, which is where they live. And the children of immigrants do not know that much. I mean, they might go back to depending on the context, but might go back to the country of origin sometimes, visit the family. But what happened, the parents do not tell about all the hardship. I mean, how complicated it was. They tend to give a more rosy picture about what they've been through. So some do somehow not communicate about what was at stake and what they have been through in the country of origin sometimes when they are refugees, or maybe when they are meeting some difficulties, adjusting and facing racism in the country where they arrive.
Probably a consequence of trauma itself.
Yeah, and because they don't want to communicate about that. So what we identify that a lot of second generation from North Africa, for example, do not know that much about the history of colonization. I mean, what was the war in Algeria? What was the situation in Morocco or Tunisia? They don't have that much knowledge about it, and they might have.
Do receiving countries need to know in their own education systems? Do they need to know more?
They do, actually, and there are programs that are more and more dealing with this history, including this history in the narrative which is given, which is important, even though it's always a challenge, because there have been debate in 2004 in France about a law that was meant to acknowledge the beneficial part of colonization. That was something that raised a lot of concern and hotly debate, and at the end of the day, they did not really apply. But the idea was to include in the history curriculum some more positive ideas about what colonization was about building roads and schools, blah, 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 which was not exactly what we have seen as well. But there was this kind of, so you see, it's always a very contested field, so it's not a peaceful way to try to acknowledge what has been done in the past, and now we can build something different. And basically, the problem with this past in a lot of European countries is that it is creating more antagonism between those who are related to this history, and it's not mechanical, but there is a kind of importation of what we have built as the mental representation of the others, and what has been built to justify the European expansion throughout the rest of the world, saying that we were in a mission somehow. That was granted to advanced societies that were poorly equipped and at the bottom of the civilizational scale. So this discourse that been done a long time ago are not totally dissolved over time. And there are, the idea of clashes of civilization is still there. There have been books written about that. There have been overwhelming discourse about that. So we are not totally over it. So that's the question of how can we try to share more relation to the past, not to say that it is over and we have been moving forward, but to say that it has some kinds of consequences today. This idea that the past is past. I do remember one of the speech of Barack Obama during his first presidential campaign. It was called the Philadelphia speech, where he talked about race relation in the US, and he was saying that we have to go beyond something, but at the same time he said we cannot ignore racial inequalities and the history about race relation in the US, because he was quoting Faulkner, the past is not even the past. And that's it. We are not, the past is not even the past for most of people who are migrating today and coming to the global north, because we have an history of relation between the north and the south, and when we have created some kind of structures of disadvantage that might be reacted into the situation that we are facing now in big metropolises. So that's something we should be able to address, not to complain about it, not to be some kind of in guiltiness without any end, but to try to explain and to understand how it is shaping the consequences and the type of relation that are taking place in the societies today. So that's a task that we have. And I don't think that most of the history classes are able to deal with that today. I think it's complicated to face that.
Speaking of this update and of the fact that even if
I wanted to show the graph, just to remind us.
Coming to that, but this or the other one? Yeah,
well, both. Because when we talk about diversity, we think about the migration from non-European countries to Europe, but we tend to forget that for a long time there have been a huge emigration from Europe to the rest of the world. And we are talking, if you pile up all these numbers, maybe it's complicated to do, it makes 52 million of Europeans that went away to live in the Americas, but also in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and different places outside of Europe. So this immigration have shaped what is diversity throughout the world. Otherwise, I mean, why there would be such diversity in the US or in Canada or in Brazil? That's the consequence of the history of immigration. So when we talk about migration, immigration now, we tend to forget that this process has shaped also Europe. As another one, which was not bringing people in, but getting people out during the massive demographic explosion that happened during the 90s and the beginning of the 20th century. So
this is a good example of the gap between subjective assumptions and objective science, isn't it? Hearing this, 52 million European emigrating in the course of history, is you know, an incentive to revise one's own perceptions of one's own history. And connected to that, I'd like to ask you, what do we need to do in order to transfer this objectifiable knowledge about the phenomena of migration, both in more recent history and in the past? How do we bring it into the present? How do we let it, you know, make it transferable to society, to the practitioners, to teachers, to pupils?
Policymakers. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. But in a nutshell, it's pretty deceiving that all the knowledge that a lot of research has compiled about migration, what we know about it, we're not so much, we don't have so much knowledge, but we have some. And for example, we have a big knowledge, which is those who are migrating are not those who are the most deprived in the societies. It's more the middle class, those who receive education and see and project themselves and have the potential to project themselves somewhere else. And so, conversely to the idea that migration is bringing the poorest of the poorest inside other societies, is not exactly what happened. It's more people who are full of resources who are migrating. Not always, but mostly. And this is a knowledge that we convey to policymakers, but they never ever take stock about that. And for a good reason, is that policy making is not, even though there is an expectation to do evidence-based policy, the idea that we have to nourish ourselves from knowledge to be able to have more adapted policies. In reality, policies are shaped by answering to short-term public opinion expectation, which is not always well perceived or well known, and to have an agenda for very short-term decision. So it's not really, it's complicated to transfer to that. And to the public opinion itself, it's also very complicated because there are more concrete everyday news which are conveying another notion. You can think about, a few days ago there have been we mentioned that in the previous roundtable about the murder of an history teacher in a school in France, which is horrific, and that creates an emotion, rightly so, but it is changing all the picture about what we can say about, well, this is an exception, this is not exactly representing the threat of migration, that's something different. But nevertheless, it is perceived as a kind of example that will represent a threat which is attached to any kind of migration. So it's complicated to go against this kind of emotions which are unstable. I mean, it's hard not to be moved by what happened. But at the same time, the sociological meaning of that is not exactly what has been said.
Right. As captivating as this is, I'm afraid I have to introduce the last round of questions and reactions that I want to prompt from you. And for the closing round, I'd like to postulate a preposterous idea, perhaps. I think, in my experience or in my intuition, the barometer of integration of any migrant into any society is participation in the system, in anything that happens socially, in culture in general. And I don't mean elitist culture. And having said that, I think that we are approaching a stage where a certain level of maturity has been reached by generations after generations of migrants when they are starting to claim their own voice in their receiving societies, so to speak. And I'd like to show a few examples of that, and I'd like to invite you to tell me whether you think I'm right or wrong. Yeah, just invite your critical opinion. This is, again, a picture of an intervention by Ai Weiwei here in Berlin. Of course, I chose it on purpose. You can see the Konzerthaus Berlin at the top. It's an older work, again, with the live vests found on Greek beaches this time. I'd also like to show you one of the projects that has been topical in the past few years, namely the opening of a so-called Exil Museum, a museum of exile here in Berlin. The opening is planned for 2028. And from Vienna, I brought this example, which is more or less a virtual museum, if you want. It only exists as an activist platform. It's called MUSMIG, Museum der Migration, Migration Museum. And the aim is to make it concrete, to obtain an actual location in which migrant communities curate their own exhibition. Exhibition is the wrong word, probably. Their own presence in the receiving society. And I found a very, very interesting exhibit of this sort. This is the actual van, and because the Museum of Migration doesn't exist yet physically, this is an object that kind of made it into the official collection of the Technical Museum in Vienna. Yeah, you see the contradiction there. This is a van with which I can't remember, I think 22 Iraqi migrants came across the Austrian border in 2015, I suppose it was. And to just start us off into the last round, and I'd also like to open the floor for proposals and questions and interventions. I'd like you to think of an object of your own that you think would be worthy of making it into this collection. You know, a collectible to symbolize the experience of migration and the perspective of our migration societies. Any ideas? It doesn't need to be an object, it can be, I don't know, any kind of literary contribution or...
Take a voting card. I think that voting card is something quite important for refugees and migrants, maybe because I'm a day after the voting in Poland. But it's, I think that if I can have 1 minute after this stating the object, I think that this is very interesting, and like I found your remarks very inspiring, because firstly, this I think that we are inviting the migrants to kind of aim at a moving target in a way. And I talking with lots of refugees and migrants whom we hire or with whom we work, that they feel that they don't really know what is expected, or what is this model that they are expected to kind of conform to. and that this is really something on the move. And I also think that our own identity is changing. Like I said, that this experience of hosting Ukrainians affects the identity of Poles. Of course, it also affects the identity of Ukrainians. But we just all evolve all the time, and expecting something from the refugees and migrants, I think very often we are naive in our kind of understanding what we really want, and often it is hard to tell. And often the people, what I also wanted to comment on, that very often the people get conflicting messages. And like, for example, we claim that we have European values, but if you think about it, I mean, this is not what the experience is. And like people who are pushed back, like I was talking on the Belarusian border, they don't respect, they don't feel, this is not what they are welcomed with. This is not dignity, this is not human rights, this is not, I don't know, access to healthcare, this is not respect for children. So whatever we identify as European values, very often we don't come as if we had them. And I think that this is quite problematic. And also I very much echo what you said before, that us as Europeans, we are very narrow in the way that we think about this. We also have in Poland a community of Black Poles, which I'm super interested in to hear more. But it's our recognition that Poland is not what it was in the 50s, is very, very shallow, and we don't realize who we are, really. And I think that this is kind of worth mentioning.
I wasn't planning on saying this, but I have to enthusiastically agree with the idea of including a voting card into, some kind of museum of migration. My own experience is that I moved to Austria from Romania, where I was born and grew up. I think it was something like 96. I can't even remember anymore because it's been so many decades. Yeah, and I've been living there, and I speak the language, and I teach at the university, and I've been working there all my life. I've never paid taxes anywhere else. But do you know what? I still can't vote, and it's the most frustrating thing ever. So thank you for your idea. Any other proposals? Please feel free to contribute.
Yeah, I also paid taxes for a very long time, and I couldn't. And I think I will take a lot of the things to this museum. One of the very first papers I got here was the Identifikationssteuernummer, which was
Steueridentifikationsnummer.
Yeah. But I will take actually two things. One of the things is the amount of the
Tax
papers.
identification number.
Oh, thank you.
A tax identification number.
Yes, it's difficult. It's different than the tax number. It's another thing. It's another number. We have a lot of numbers here. I would take the whole amount of papers and bureaucracies that the people has to go through. And trust me, it's a lot.
Collected over the years.
Yes, and not over the year. Even in the first year maybe, or the first 2 years until you get your residency permit, it's huge in a language that you don't know, and you have a lot of fear of doing something wrong. And actually, many of the German-speaking people, they don't really understand when it comes to bureaucracy, and you have to go through all of this. So it's really a huge amount of paper. I would really love to go through all over the places. And the other thing that I would like to bring with me, it's something called Fiktionsbescheinigung. And it is, and actually a friend author of mine also published a poem on Weiterschreiben about this very certificate card that people get when they apply. And it's actually, a card that, it tells a lot of what it is. You are not legal here. You're not really still allowed to be here. And the state and the country is actually needs to go through your case. And until then, you don't really exist.
Sorry, can you tell us again what it is? What kind of Bescheinigung?
Fiktionsbescheinigung. So it's fiction. It's fiction.
Okay.
Yeah, it comes from fiction.
Fiction confirmation.
Yes. So, and through this time, you really feel like, because you're not a Syrian anymore or whatever the place you came from, and you're not still legal here with your papers and everything. And in this state, you can't really work, you can't really move, and all of you have this fiction card and it's actually a number. And it's very difficult and traumatizing to a lot of people to have this cards. And I would say I would use us, and all of us had it in some point. So I think I will take with me to the museum. And in Weiterschreiben, we will be working about this next year, I believe.
Just
more.
to confirm that you're not fiction, probably. Patrick, what would you include in such a museum?
That would be okay. So, because I'm a demographer, I would think about putting a census form in different language. It might sound strange, but until recently, the French census was done only in French, and well, it didn't come to my mind. But how do people who do not speak French do to fill in? Because they count. They live in France too. And so there have been a recent adaptation, and that's a good move. But until recently, it was taken for granted that people would make their way to answer to the census form in French. So that's the power of language somehow. And there are similar type of census form in everywhere in the world. What you could have a multi-language census form to try to count and to include every person who are living in the country as members to be registered. So that's a good representation of who counts into a society.
It truly is. Nadette, what about you?
Well, I see the van there. For Ireland, that would have to be a very large truck. And tragically, we've had several criminal cases of people being found dead in trucks on their way to Ireland. And we've had people. So, it would also be a site of memory and of grieving and of commemoration. But you've inspired me there with the voting cards and the census forms, because we actually had a government justifying up to about 2002 or 2000, I can't remember exactly, it was 2002 or 2006, and refusing to put an ethnicity question in the census, even though we'd had a European Year Against Racism and we had a national commission on racism that I was an independent member of, and we had all these arguments with the government, and they said, no, sure, we don't really need that, yet, So that's how recent our government has, not seen migration, even though they've welcomed people to particular jobs, Indian software engineers, Latvian mushroom pickers or whatever, at every end of the labour market. But that is something. So I think I would put the two census forms, the one before we had an ethnicity question and the one after. That would certainly be good artefacts.
Right, thank you very much. We now have time for 2 or 3 quick questions, as short as possible, please.
Thank you so much for your contributions. I've particularly found them constructive in some way, and they brought a lot of comprehension to the complexity of the question, even though you weren't discussing how to solve problems, but I somehow feel inspired to learn and make the world better. For me, maybe the object, the artifact that I thought of, but I only wanted to use it as an incentive for the question to all of you, is some kind of mythology. Because just as you mentioned the cuddly migrant and many other examples there, I think there are a lot of myths that are happening right now, and maybe in connection also to the first panel, my question will be how do we prevent those mythologies from coming to existence? Because there is maybe a cuddly migrant, but there is also this welcoming European. There is this idea that if you meet certain conditions, you're more than welcome here. Or there's also the myth of the not enough qualified people to work as doctors in Germany. Like, there's so much cynical lies in those myths. And how can we, and I think, why is it that after the Second World War, how do we learn from history without the history becoming this kind of, myth that we can't do anything about? Thank you.
Any reactions? Do you think mythology?
Yeah, well, I'll give it a go. We have a myth in Ireland, in our own language, Irish. We say Céid Míle Fáilte, which means 100,000 welcomes. So we see ourselves as a very welcoming country. So when people then experience racism or attacked physically, or have to move out of their house or whatever, we find it very difficult to cope with this. And one young migrant woman spoke recently and said that every time there is a kind of a verbal assault or something, microaggression, it's one of those 100,000 welcomes that's taken away from her. And I thought it was a really good way of kind of repositioning our sense of ourselves. And I think it is very difficult. In Ireland, I was going to talk more about the famine, but we had a famine in 1845 to 1849. And of those statistics you had, Patrick, 1.5 million Irish emigrated to the States between 1845 and 1855. So we saw ourselves until very recently as a country of emigrants, and still do to some extent. And I think it's sort of caught up in our identity. So that it's a huge psychological shift to really move to actually see, why would people want to come to Ireland? Because we've always gone away. And there are still young Irish people, because we have a housing and a homelessness crisis. There are people leaving every day from Ireland to go to Australia, or New Zealand, or the States, or elsewhere. So those myths are very difficult. But one of the commitments that's being made, Catherine Day, she's a retired civil servant from the European Commission. She's retired back to Ireland, and we've kept her very busy looking at ending what our system of keeping international protection applicants in private, profit-driven accommodation in appalling conditions with, really not meeting their needs or their rights. And she has now proposed a wonderful system of the government building centres, and this government has embraced that. The last election, they came in with a platform to do that, but of course, then 95,000 Ukrainians came, and the number of international protection applicants doubled in 1 year from 7,000 to 14,000. So I think the thing is what she's proposing is that the government has to take the misinformation seriously. That this is about social cohesion. It's about intimidation being whipped up by right-wing people, and there are real fears, especially in working-class marginalised communities, who can see their families never being able to afford to have a house, maybe even never to be able to rent a house properly. We have thousands of people in homeless conditions, including 4,500 children. So. She has now said to the government, with her committee, that really the government has to take this very seriously and do a public awareness campaign to explain that migrants in Ireland, in the south of Ireland, are on average more educated than the local population. They're more likely to have a master's degree. Strangely enough, in Northern Ireland, it's not that case. Migrants are more likely to be less educated than the local population. But those public information campaigns at all levels are absolutely essential, because the myth of the dangerous male refugee or asylum seeker is out there, and there's a huge amount of lies and misinformation that need to be counteracted.
Yes, we'll need to balance reality and mythology. I think the gentleman in the second row wanted to...
Thank you. I'm Erkki Tuomioja, chairman of Historians Without Borders, and I'd like to include in that museum a history book, because I would like to hear your reactions on the effects migration has had or should have on the teaching of history in our schools. Because if history teaching continues in a very nationalist, old-fashioned way, starting with, according to a popular misconception, probably not ever true, but in French schools you read Notre ancestor les Gaules, and if more than half of the students have nothing to do with that part of the history, but they have their own history, they have their own background. So how do you deal with this within history education? It cannot continue on the same basis as it has been done up to now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. We have talked about changes in curricula. Perhaps a bit more concretely, what would be the most important thing that you'd change? What would you include?
If I may, I think that coming back to the previous panel in the morning, that really need guts. That you have to have the courage to face realities, and you have to just open your eyes and see what the world is like. I think that also kind of a little bit linking to your question, that what helps in Poland, because I mean, generally I think that a lot of fake information and misconceptions and myths come from fears and from what people want to hear because they feel insecure. So I think that giving people space to speak up and to voice somehow or be open about what they fear and what they're concerned with is helpful. In this process of hosting, for example, I was in my own home village, I was running kind of a semi-self-therapeutic group for the hosts to be able to tell out loud and speak about what they feel being hosts and what they are afraid of, and just giving people space to be heard, I think, is important. And I think it also relates to this historical question, that people become more open to hearing maybe unpleasant news about themselves if they don't feel that it would undermine their, I don't know what, self-judgment or how they perceive themselves. It's in Poland we have a very practical problem or issue to work with, which is our self-perception that we are not a colonial country. And if you hear the Polish politicians, they are very proud, or they often quote Germany actually, or France, or I don't know, Belgium or Netherlands, that unlike all those, Poland was not a colonial power. But then if you really look closer, our behavior in the now Ukrainian lands was colonial. And it's something that has to be told at one point. And if thinking about once, we would need to rework who we are and who we were and what our ancestors has done, even though we think they were all very noble.
Thank you. I think one more question back there. Thank you.
Markus Meckel, I would like to raise a question. I know that it's not possible to answer it in the end, but you talked about, and I was very happy about that differentiation you made, but the question of integration was not really raised. And I think that in that field it is a very important point how to do it and with which aim. And this is my question. Is the aim the assimilation of the migrants after one or two generations? Is that the aim, or has there to be the acceptance of migrants who wish to continue their identity as Syrians, as whatever they are, in a community, if they are not alone, if they are really a community, for instance, with Ukrainians in Poland, and there are a lot, if they would like in a village or in a region to say we would like to live in Poland, we would like exactly to learn the language and part of the country, and we would like to be citizens. But even that we would like to continue to be Ukrainians, even continue with our language to care for. Is that a right which is acceptable or not?
Thank you. Patrick? would you like to react?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, that's the standard theory of assimilation is actually there is not a strong contradiction between being able to keep some kind of specificities, cultural specificities, or having more contacts with people with the same background than you, and being part of the society. The question is more, how are you recognized as one of us? How does it happen? And that's the trigger. Does it imply that you are totally invisible, disappearing into the society without any recognized sign of otherness, like a language or, I don't know, full consumption or cultural practices, religious practices? Is that something that puts you apart? Or is it possible to conceive that the society is opening to type of activities that were not there before and are perceived as, in this two-way process we mentioned, are part of the society now? I mean, basically, as we all know, Islam was not very much represented in most European societies. Now it's an important religion within most of European countries. So if you decide that Islam is not part of the society, people who are Muslims are not part of the society, and you ask them to change. That is, to not to be Muslim, to be part of the society, which is an expectation that goes against any kind of rights and doesn't make sense itself. So, what we have to understand and to make it possible is to see the negotiation on how to take part of society with change in your own trajectories, and that happened every time. I mean, it's for everyone there are changes. Of course, you incorporate part of the everyday life around you, the institutions, the history itself. And you mentioned the fact that how do you relate to the history of a country where you don't come from? Well, actually, it's pretty strong. Sometimes people do really relate to these ancestors that you don't really have, but they are part of your own history very quickly. But you have also to include some kind of different histories as well in the history of the society where you live. So that's a challenge. So in a nutshell, I think assimilation as a one-way process as it has been conceived for a long time doesn't work. What works is more a dialectical transformation of a society that are incorporating and embracing an enlargement of their own repertoire. And that's what we face. I mean, most of our societies are like that. I mean, couscous, after all, is one of the main dishes in France. It's not something that comes from the history of France, but it is. And curry is a national dish in the UK. So, well, that's part of the transformation of the societies as well.
Yes, allowing people to truly participate is probably one of the markers, or one of the important markers of authentic integration. Please, Agnieszka.
I just wanted to say that kind of from the Polish fresh learning experience is that trying to build some consistency between people that are different, what we think about, because we don't yet have an answer, that while kind of having this consensus of who comes from where is not there, we kind of realize that we need some kind of new glue. That like before, having this identity of the community in Poland, it was kind of easy because you had one religion or color skin or, I don't know, history. And it was easy to define who is yours and who is, with who, relatively, but with whom you are a community. And now people are lost on what to build this feeling of belonging. I think that we are in the process of looking for this new glue that is not yet there.
Thank you.
Yes. Just briefly, there was a very positive story in Ireland. We had refugees, mainly Jewish refugees, who came in the 1880s and 1890s, mainly from Lithuania. And we have a settled Jewish community. It's smaller. It got smaller, but in fact it's growing again because there are a lot of Jewish software engineers coming in for these high-skilled visas. So, but they're a community that have retained their ethnic and religious and cultural practices and their own food practices, but become very much part of society. The first equality minister in Ireland, Mervyn Taylor, in the 1990s, was from the Jewish community. We've had Belfast and Dublin Lord Mayors from the Jewish community, and they're very much part of, politics, and it may have taken them, some decades to get to that status, but they certainly achieved it. So, I mean, certainly, we would believe that integration is much more than assimilation. I think the Muslim community in Ireland is the fastest growing religious community, and we're probably up to about 60 or 70,000. In fact, the ethnic figures, the census figures on ethnicity and faith are coming out next week, so it'll be very interesting to see the detail of the transformation. But certainly it is about reimagining your own sense of who is Irish, and Irish Muslims are as Irish as I am.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I have to cut this short. I was asked to finish earlier and I haven't really managed. I apologize. There's still some program to be announced and we all need to get there. Thank you very, very much for your participation, for your contributions. Extremely captivating. We could have gone on forever, probably. All the very best. Thank you for your contributions and for being here, and have a nice evening. Thank you very much.